very good evening to you all, and thank you for joining us for this session. And today we are going to look at data analysis and also how to write a qualitative report towards the end of the session. So I want to start our discussion with just a few questions. It is good, and as I was looking at your papers, I was thinking about do we understand the questions that guide qualitative research? And to start us off, it's good to look at like 3 questions that are common in qualitative research. Now, qualitative research, as I said, is about the experiences of people, and therefore it's not about the numbers. And some of the questions that we ask in qualitative research are questions that we cannot ask in quantitative research. For instance, what? If, for instance, we're asking about reasons, or we're asking about the nature of something, a question like, what is the nature of stigma associated with COVID-19? Right now, we are dealing with COVID-19 pandemic, and it has a lot of stigma around it. If you're going to ask a question like, what is the nature of stigma associated with COVID-19, then that question can only be answered through interviewing or talking to people and understanding how they interpret the whole scenario, the whole and the experiences of stigma. Then the other one is the other question is how. How do individuals suffering from COVID-19 manage stigma associated with that disease? And exactly that question is about the experiences of the people again. You can only know about how people manage stigma if you listen to their stories, if you listen to their narrative. And the third question that is also critical to qualitative research is why. And a question that you can ask in regard to COVID-19 is, for instance, why are Kenyans not volunteering for COVID-19 mass testing? So all these 3 questions are important questions and can help you to get an in-depth understanding of a phenomena or like COVID-19. We also, during our semester, looked at various strategies that we can use. Some scholars will call them traditions when you are exploring qualitative issues. And some of the strategies include the narrative research, phenomenological research, grounded theory research, ethnographic research, and case study research or qualitative case study research. Now, all these types of research have different focus. For instance, narrative research focuses or explores the life of an individual, and the phenomenological research, its focus is understanding the essence of the experience. While grounded theory research, the focus is to develop a theory grounded in the data from the field. The ethnographic research focus is to describe and interpret a culture sharing group. You need to look into a cultural group and understand some experiences, some phenomena, some activities that people do and how they interpret those activities. And finally, the case study research focus is usually to develop an in-depth description and analysis of a case. You can even do a case study of one person or a case study of one organization or multiple cases if you want to compare those cases. In that case, the research problem, for instance, for a narrative research, is people telling stories of their experiences. Well, the same for phenomenological research is, trying to understand the essence of lived experiences, the meanings that people attach to lived experiences. And the ground theory views looks into the views of participants, and the aim is to come up with a theory grounded on that data. Then the ethnographic research describe and interpret shared patterns of a culture of a group. You know, somebody want to talk about, you know, or to understand the structure of a certain shared culture of a group. Then the case study, as I said earlier, its aim is to focus or to give an in-depth understanding of a case. If, for instance, if you want to understand the experience of somebody who suffers from a chronic illness, then you can do a case study of one person or many people. When you're doing qualitative data analysis, I usually advise students to think of the process of data analysis in 4 major steps. The first step is data collection. So remember that qualitative research, you know, the processes of data collection and all the other are continuous. And I will talk about this later. So let me start with data collection. You know, in data collection, there are so many tools that you can use to collect data. We have talked of observation. We have talked of interviews during our previous classes. We have talked of documents, analyzing documents. We have talked of recording, analyzing recordings, and so on. Now, from there, the next step is usually called data reduction. And data reduction is about selecting this data, focusing on specific data, simplifying this data, abstracting it, and transforming this data. Then you're going to have data display. That is, how do you display this data? You can do it using matrices. You can do that using graphs, network charts, or network diagrams, and even charts. And the final one is drawing conclusion from this data and giving those conclusions meanings and confirming and verifying that those meanings are valid. So these are the major steps that you go through when you're doing qualitative data analysis. Previously, also, we have talked about the forms of data, and there are several of them. You might have data in form of interview scripts. You might have data in form of participants' observation field notes, journals, documents, drawings, artifacts, photographs, videos, internet sites, email correspondence, among many other forms of data that you can analyze in qualitative research. Then if you have this data ready, then we can go straight to the initial processes of preparing this data. And how do you prepare this data? For instance, if you have field notes, remember field notes are the notes that we write sometimes using shorthand when you're interviewing people, when you're observing, and therefore you need now to expand these field notes into write-ups that people can understand. So, and I'm saying this because I know in psychology you do a lot of observation. So you need to prepare this data. Field notes are important forms of data for a number of researchers, including the psychologist. So a write-up is an intelligible product for anyone, not just for the field worker. And it can be read, edited for accuracy, commented on, coded, analyzed using several of the methods we shall discuss later in this session. Now, I want to discuss a very important part that is always very problematic to many students, and this is transcribing. So you have interviewed somebody in another language other than English, like Kiswahili, Kamba, Gikuyu language. You need to transcribe that data. And beyond transcription, there is also translation. If, for instance, you interviewed somebody in Kamba language, then it means that you need to translate that script, then you transcribe it. So there are several types of transcription, and I'll only discuss 3: the intelligent verbatim, verbatim, and true verbatim. Now, intelligent verbatim, as you can see there, involves transcription with detailed editing, some minor paraphrasing to create an easy to read transcript. Now, unless you are interested in the mistakes that people make when they are talking, people talk in a very chaotic way, and their structures are not always grammatical. Do you want to put them down in writing in such a grammatical manner? So unless, again, you're dealing with conversational analysis where even grammar matters and even how words were ordered matter, then intelligent verbatim may become a very important type of transcription in this case. Then there is verbatim, and verbatim is 1 degree more detailed than intelligent verbatim transcription. In this style, every word on the recording is transcribed as it is, including grammatical errors and false starts when people start and they put what we call fillers. Those you still want to have them in your script because perhaps they mean something. So, however, extra details like starter or repetition may be removed depending on what you're looking for in your study. And this transcription style is preferred by students, researchers, and journalists who need transcripts that are true to the recording, yet uncluttered by unnecessary details. Now, the final one is called true verbatim. Now, true verbatim is the most detailed account of recording, including every word, sound, nonverbal communication. So this is where if somebody says something and at some point they smile, you put in bracket, he said this and smiled. He said this and coughed again, in brackets. Because of its level of detail, this preferred transcription style for academic research and analysis where every detail matters. What is included? Every word on the recording including the nonverbal communication like laughter, pauses, ambient sounds like people coughing, child crying in the background, you include them. These distractors or detractors sometimes may mean something. They may mean something. There's some people by just hearing the sound of a baby crying in the background, it may affect them because perhaps they have gone through a traumatic moment and they lost a baby. So the cry of that baby probably means something to them. So if they stop right in the middle of what they were saying until the baby stops crying, then probably you need to take note of that. It means something. So what is not included? Starters and pauses that are irrelevant to the script and break the flow of reading. Now, this is important to understand that even if some people stutter when they are anxious. So if the stutter is important to what you are researching, please include it. If the pauses are important to what you are researching, include them. But when they are not important or they're irrelevant to the script and to the research, then you may want to do away with them. So if that is clear, then I can go to the process of coding the data. Now we have the data and it is transcribed. Then we need to code this data. And before we code this data, it's important to understand some terms that we shall come across during our discussion. And one of them is codes and the other one is coding. So we need to understand these two terms as clearly as possible. Now, codes are labels that we assign symbolic, meaning to the descriptive or inferential information compiled during study. When you are doing coding, you select a chunk of information and you give it a symbolic meaning. you give it a representative meaning. You want to say that that chunk of information can be summarized by maybe saying, this represents an emotion, a certain emotion. What somebody said in that chunk of information shows this kind of an emotion. So that's what you're saying. Saldana 2013, and I want you to take note of this author because this author is very central to data analysis in qualitative research, defines a code as most often a word or short phrase that symbolically assign a summative, salient essence capturing and/or evocative attribute for a portion of language-based or visual data. Now, in simple terms, it's simply saying what we have just said, above there, that whatever you have highlighted or the chunk of information that you have highlighted, you can actually come up with a code that will summarize that symbolically. As I said, you can summarize a chunk of information by saying this represents a certain emotion. Codes are first assigned to data chunks to detect occurring patterns. So if you summarize and find a certain emotion like anger, then it occurs again, then it tells you that anger probably is going to be a major theme in your study. From these patterns, similar codes are clustered together to create small number of categories or pattern codes. Yes, once you code chunks and different chunks of information and add up with so many, then you're going to look at similar codes. For instance, if you have coded one chunk of information as anger, you find another one, you call it joy, you find another one, you call it frustration, then you can categorize all these as, emotions. Then the interrelationships of categories with each other then are constructed to develop higher level of analytic meaning. So later, what we do is to look at the relationship between these categories. We started with codes, then we have now categories. After combining several codes, now we need to look at the relationship between these categories. And it is at this level of an analysis that you can now come up with assertions or propositions or hypotheses, that is intelligent guesses, or even theories about a certain issue. So this is how people do the analysis and come up with such such concepts or assertions or propositions. Then what is coding? Coding is analysis. In essence, when you talk about coding, you're saying you're analyzing. You are putting these chunks of information together and labeling them or giving them symbolic labels. So coding is condensing that information. You have come from the field with a big, with a huge amount of information, and you want to condense it. You want to make sense out of it. You make sense out of this information by coding. Now, coding is also heuristic. It requires a lot of flexibility and creativity, and it's almost like a common sense thing. You have to think outside the box. You look at a chunk of information here and you ask yourself, what does this mean? There's nowhere we are going to have a uniform or a formula of how you're going to code. It's kind of heuristic. You need to use your common sense. You need to be creative. You need to read carefully. You need to reflect. Most important is to reflect. And that's why we say, as I said in the steps here, the first step after data collection is to immerse yourself into this, into the data that you have collected. Immerse yourself, and immersing yourself means actually reading, cross-reading of the data that you have collected and reflecting on it. so that you can start understanding what are the, can answer basic questions like, what are people saying in this research? Then the other important question is, how then do you decide what to code? Now, we decide what to code by looking at how the information that we are reading from the scripts, how it is organized, the regularity, how often is something coming up. And you can look at this by, first of all, looking at similar things. There's no way 20 people can be saying things that are similar and then there is nothing about it. They are saying something about that thing. So similarity is very important. Then something else that may trigger or may help you to know what to code or what to categorize is the difference. It becomes very interesting when a group of people say one thing and suddenly another group of people say something else totally different from what was said by another group. For instance, you may find that gender can become a very important factor. When you ask the same question to ladies or women, they may give you response A. You ask the same question to men and they give you response B. Now that needs to be coded. Does gender differentiate the way people experience and make meanings of the things they go through? Then frequency. How often something happens? After every now and then something happens that people interpret. You need to code that if it is something that is coming up so frequently in your story. Then sequence. Now, this you need also to be on your alert about the sequence, how people see things, how people look at things, and the sequence of how things happen. It's important because it is part of how they create these meanings. So do they see this happen so that another thing can happen? For instance, there's a time some participants told me that when you see this kind of symptom of a disease, then it means somebody is going to die. So then in the family, so that then means something. So sequence is very important. What are people saying and how are they looking at events in terms of sequence? Then correspondence. They happen in relation to other activities or events. So when you realize that so many people are saying that when something happens, then another one has to happen, or when people are stressed, this other activity happens, then you need to be keen on that. Then causation. One appears to cause the other. When you read narratives and you realize that, oh, it looks like for this kind of a phenomena, there is a cause. These causes may be many, or it could be one cause that is causing the distress or stress among these people. So then it's also important, having looked at how we can code this data, it's also important to understand that sometimes we carry some filters, we wear some kind of glasses. The worldview that we have influences the way we interpret and perceive information. And this is not different when it comes to transcription and coding of information. So for instance, look at this statement. There is no place in this country for illegal immigrant. Allow them up and send those criminals back to where they come from. Now, one person may simply code this information as no praise. The participant is simply saying there is no praise. A second researcher, an urban ethnographer, employing descriptive coding to document and categorize the breadth of opinion stated by multiple participants, might code the same data this way. There is no place in this country for illegal immigrants. Route them up and send those criminals back to where they came from. That's a migration issue. However, a third researcher, a critical theorist, may look at this as the same information as xenophobia. And I believe if the same thing was said in US or other countries where racism is live, then it may become or it may be seen as racism. Then let me talk about now what kind of filters are these that may make people to actually see things so differently. One is culture. One writer defined culture as software of the mind. Culture defines the way we see things, the way we interpret things, the way we view issues, and even give meanings to phenomenon. Religion is another important filter that may actually affect the way we code data. If you are a Christian, if you are a Muslim, or you're from any other religion, the way you see issues, the way you see phenomena or activities or behavior of people may be shaded or may be influenced by the religion that you're coming from. The other factor is level of involvement. How involved are you? Are you a member of the group that is being researched? You can imagine if you are doing a research as a born-again Christian. Let me just use Christianity. I know we are from different faiths. You can imagine a born-again Christian doing a research on single-sex marriage or men who have sex with men. And you can imagine if a member of that group did the same research. Definitely, these two people are going, or these two researchers are going to see the outcome of the research in different ways, mostly because of the level of involvement. Then other filters include the gender, the social class, the race, ethnicity of your participants, and even yourself. Also, the type of data you are collecting and from whom you are collecting this data. Are you collecting the data from adults or from children? Definitely, that data may not be the same, and even how you filter or how you view the interpretations of the meanings may be different. So all these filters, it's important that you know that they may affect the way you filter information or you do the coding. All right, so there are many types of codes that are commonly used in qualitative data analysis, but I just want to discuss a few because we do not have time. And again, this is just the beginning. You need to read a little bit about all these processes in data analysis in qualitative research. So you may decide to to use a set of already existing code with your data. And this is called a priori code. Now, a priori codes are developed before examining the current data, before examining the data. You can get these a priori codes either from your theory, or you had already brainstormed, or you already have a conceptual framework that gives you hints of what to expect in your data. So you can start with those and then later look at other emerging codes from the data. So many qualitative researchers like to develop the code as they they do the data analysis, and these codes are usually called inductive codes. And inductive codes, by definition, are codes that are developed by a researcher by directly examining the data. There's no problem if you combine both. In fact, I advise my students to try both. You can start with a priori code, okay, what you already know, and it may come from theories, it may come from models, it may come from conceptual framework, or or it can come from thinking about the data or skimming through the data. But also you can also do the inductive codes or do both of approaches. You can use the two approaches. So what gets coded? Now, this is a huge question if you think about what shall we code? What gets coded? Now, for us to think about this question and to respond to it adequately, then we need to think about units of social organization. And scholars have concluded that social life happens at 4 coordinates. It happens at participants, the intersection of one or more, that is how people or the participants that you're going to deal with, how they intersect, how they interact, how they behave when they're interacting. You can decide to look at that. The other the other coordinate of social life is behavior, engaging in one or more activity, what people do. So you can decide to think about what people do. And you can also decide to think about a phenomena from the time. When do they do it? And finally, the fourth one is where do they do it? So these 4 coordinates are critical when you're thinking of what gets coded. The following have been identified as major units of social organization, and they can also help you when you think about what gets coded. Number 1 is the cultural practice. That is the daily routine, occupational tasks, and microcultural activities. If, for instance, you're doing an ethnographic study, then the cultural practices can help you a lot when you're collecting data. Think about the daily routine, think about the occupational tasks, think about the microcultural activities that go on in that cultural group. Number 2 are the episodes. And here we are talking about unanticipated or irregular activities such as divorce. And in psychology, I believe those who are dealing with family issues, these can be very interesting things to focus on. Championships, if you're looking at games, or disasters like fire or earthquake, you can decide to focus on those, those activities or those such things. So you can decide to do coding, looking as, focusing on episodes. Then another way of coding is to look at encounter, types of encounter. If, for instance, you're looking at how people relate, what kind of an encounter did they have? Was it a temporary interaction between 2 people? Like the sales individuals, the way, is it that kind of an encounter, or was it a long-term kind of an encounter? Then you can also decide when you're coding to focus on roles. When you're reading the scripts, do specific roles emerge from the data for mothers? If you're studying a certain community, what are the specific roles of women as opposed to men? Then the other aspect, or the other social unit of social organization, or something that you can focus on when you're coding is the social and personal relationship. What were they like? Is it, are we talking of a relationship like husband and wife? Or what kind of a relationship are we talking about? Sometimes you may have data if you're dealing, for instance, with young people, and the kind of information you're getting from that data gives you a hint of or characteristics of groups like gangs, or, or cliques of, something like that. So those can be also coded. You look at your narrative in terms of what kind of groups appear from the data. Then something else that may be interesting when people are talking about their stories is the organizations that they have, gone through. They could be schools, they could be restaurants. Some people talk about prisons, some people talk about corporations. And as much as we may sometimes not realize, organizations largely shape the way people are and the way they behave sometimes. Some of the cultures, some of the behaviors that people pick come from organizations that they have worked in. Another aspect is settlements and habitats where people live. And another one is subcultures and lifestyles. You may look into the narratives that you have, and they may actually be leading you to subcultures and lifestyles like uh, you know, homelessness, and groups like gay and other groups in our societies. Then the other one is cognitive aspects or meanings. Some data will give you some very interesting information about ideologies that people hold and how they influence their life. Some people are deeply influenced by ideologies, by beliefs, by self-concepts, by identities. And probably you're going to encounter this kind of data or this kind of information in your data. Other include emotional aspects or feeling. And I will not dwell on that because you in psychology, you do a lot of that. And others will include hierarchical aspects or inequalities. Now, if you listen to stories from US and you listen to people describing their life, most of the time, social inequality or racial inequality often comes up. So these are some of the things that you may look at when you're looking for, now what do I code? What will get coded? So this is a good start, or this is somewhere you can start. Now, when we think about coding, I think about it from 2 points of view or 2 levels. And I'm actually using Sandana's book, and another one they have written with Matthew and Huberman in 2014. So these 2 books are critical for those who are going to end up doing qualitative research and you want to fully understand data analysis in qualitative research. It's important that you look for these 2 books, one by Saldana in 2013 or 2014, and the other one by Matthew Huberman and Saldana in 2014. These authors describe 2 cycles of data analysis in qualitative research. The first cycle is, coding method, are codes that initially assigned to the data chunks. We shall get into details about that. And the second one now is about analyzing or getting the patterns, as we said earlier, from the first cycle. Let's talk a bit about the first cycle. Now, the first cycle coding method are codes initially assigned to data chunks. You pick a chunk of information and you evaluate it and you think, well, this is emotions. What kind of emotion are they? This is anger. So that is a chunk of information that you have coded anger. First cycle coding method includes up to 25 different approaches. Obviously, we may not look at all these approaches, and that's why I have given you these two titles below there. Huberman, Miles, and Saldana 2014, Qualitative Data Analysis, a methods source book. This book is very critical for any PhD who is doing qualitative research and you want to understand data analysis. The other book that is equally critical is Saldana 2015, The Coding Manual for Qualitative Researchers. So if you are going to do your thesis and you're going to use qualitative research, then I highly recommend these two books so that you can fully understand how to do data analysis and effectively so. So to start us off with the first cycle, I'll discuss three methods or three approaches of coding. The first one is called descriptive. The second one is called in vivo coding. And the third one is called process coding. Let us now look at each of them in detail. The descriptive coding. A descriptive coding assigns label to data to summarize in word or short phrase, most often a noun. And the basic topic of the passage of the qualitative data. So you read a certain text coming from the data, coming from your script, and then you assign a word or a short phrase. Just like I said in a previous example, you may read a chunk of information and you assign a noun like anger, a noun like, anger, and, to symbolically represent that information. An example is given below here, and you can see you read that chunk of information, and the person who was analyzing this data decided that the person is talking about business. So that is the descriptive type of or approach of coding. Remember that these are actually the most elemental aspect of coding, the three of them, and that's why we have started with them. The second one is called in vivo coding. Now this one is the most well-known qualitative coding method. And in vivo coding uses words or short phrases from the participant's own language, what they have said. If they have said something, you pick one word or a phrase and you're going to pick it to make it the representative phrase that will symbolically represent that chunk of information. So it may include folk or indigenous terms. Sometimes you may pick the indigenous term if you want to represent something. A particular culture, subculture, microculture to suggest the existence of a group cultural category. In vivo coding is appropriate for virtually all qualitative studies, but particularly for beginning qualitative researchers learning how to code. So we recommend in vivo coding to people who are starting, to people who are beginners, because it is very easy. You just need to pick a phrase from the data and make it your code. Let's see an example of this. I hated school last year. Freshman year, it was awful. I hated it. And this year is a lot better actually. Don't know why. I guess over the summer, I kind of stopped caring about what people thought and cared more about. Just, I don't know. So like in this case now, this researcher has given it three codes. The first one, the in vivo code, is the researcher picked hated school. The second one, this year is better. And the third, stopped caring. Then the other type of code is what we call process code. Now, this coding method uses gerunds, and gerunds are words ending with ing. Going, watching, thinking, playing, exclusively to connote observable or conceptual action in the data. Now, processes also imply action intertwined with the dynamic of time, such as things that emerge, change, occur in particular sequence, or become strategically implemented. Process coding is appropriate for virtually or qualitative studies again, but particularly for grounded theory research that extracts participants' action or interaction and consequences. Here's an example. Let's look at this example to see how process coding works. I am reading this example here. Well, that's the problem, that my school is pretty small. So if you say one thing to one person and then they decide to tell two people, then those two people tell two people, and in one period everybody else knows. Everybody in the entire school knows that you said whatever it was. So how do you do the process coding? For instance, this researcher used the word spreading. You can see it ends with ing, spreading rumor, and then coded another one there, knowing what you said, knowing what you said. So for process coding, we always use the gerunds, words ending with ing. The aim is to actually denote actions or connote, get to pick actions or processes. We go to another category of codes or coding approaches, and that is analyzing subject coding. If you are doing an IPA or a study that is looking at an individual, most likely you may want to look at the subjective experiences, and these approaches probably would be good for you. You can use emotion coding, values. You look at values. You can also use evaluation coding. Let us look at each of them in detail. Emotion coding labels the emotion recorded or experienced by the participant or inferred by the researcher about the participants. Now, appropriate for this kind of coding is appropriate for studies that explore intrapersonal and interpersonal participants' experiences and actions. And it also provides insights into participants' perspectives, worldviews, and life conditions. Now, let's look at an example of emotion coding. I'm reading this example. I just hated it. When he got awarded with the honor, I mean, we are praising mediocrity now. Never mind that what you have accomplished isn't worth squat. It's all about who you know in the good old boys network. So here you're looking at the emotion that the person is actually, you can infer from the narrative. There is a lot of hatred there. So the researcher talks about or quotes this information in the first line as hated it, and the second one as bitterness. And those are the emotions that he picks. Probably if you look at it, you can pick other types of emotions as psychologists. But for now, those are the two that this researcher picked. Then let us look at the value coding, which is also a part of the subjective coding, or of when you are looking at subjective experiences. And this is the application of three different types of related codes onto qualitative data that reflect a participant's values, attitudes, and beliefs, representing his or her perspective of the world or worldview. So what is a value? In this case, we are defining here a value, which you can denote in your codes as V. is the importance we attribute to ourselves, another person, thing, or idea. And how do we define attitude? It's the way we think and feel about ourselves, another person, thing, or an idea. And finally, a belief is part of a system that include values, attitudes plus personal knowledge, experiences, opinions, prejudices, morals, and other interpretive perceptions of the social world. Value coding is appropriate for studies that explore cultural values, for instance, the ethnographic studies, identity, if you are doing a study on identity, if you're doing a study on intrapersonal and interpersonal studies, then this could be the best study for you, the best coding approach for you. So finally, in this category, we look at the evaluation coding. So this method on qualitative data, this method in qualitative data it assigns judgment about the merit, worth, or significance of program or policy. For instance, if you're evaluating a program, evaluating a policy, then you may want to put a value or a judgment or a worth. And evaluation coding is appropriate for policy, critical action, organizational evaluation studies, particularly across multiple cases, extended period of times. So the selected coding method profiled thus far, such as descriptive in vivo codes, can be applied to or supplement evaluation code. So the coding approaches that I have talked about, it doesn't mean that you use it alone. You can actually use it together with evaluation coding or evaluation coding with other types of approaches. And here, as you can see, we use a plus symbol before a code tag if it's a positive evaluation. For instance, if it's a successful thing that you have seen in the evaluation policy or report or a program, then you use a plus and you say successful. You use a plus and say candidate was qualified, use a plus, and so on. So if it is not successful, of course, you use the negative sign. Then now let's talk about exploratory coding. Remember, we are still in the first cycle of coding, and now we're in the third category here. And exploratory coding has three types or three approaches. One is called holistic coding. The other one is called provisional coding, and the other one, I'm calling it a priori coding. Now, in fact, I think I should have started with the exploratory coding, as you will see as we discuss them one by one. What is holistic coding? This method applies single code to a large unit of data in the corpus rather than line by line coding. So sometimes you may look at a chunk of information and you do not necessarily want to look at this information line by line, or you don't want to code it line by line. So this kind of approach is what we call holistic coding. It's holistic coding is often a preparatory approach to code to a unit of data before a more detailed coding or categorization process through the first or second cycle method. So you can separate chunks of information. For instance, if people are talking about beliefs or information talking about beliefs, you put it in one category, in one big theme, and call it beliefs. And then you go deep and analyze that chunk of information or in a more deeper way, so that you can now bring out the different types of beliefs, maybe beliefs in witchcraft, beliefs in God, beliefs in other deities, and so on. So that's holistic coding. Then we have provisional coding. And this approach begins with a start list of researcher-generated codes, just like the one I discussed earlier, and it based on what preparatory investigation suggests might appear in the data before they are collected and analyzed. So if you are, for instance, you're a psychologist and you're going to look at an incident, a tragic event, what do you expect that people will say? I expect that people will be afraid. So fear might be a code. So I'll start coming up with a list of what I expect to be codes. I expect anger. I expect regrets. I expect, all those types of codes that you expect when you're approaching, or when you're reviewing this kind of data. You first of all put it in a start list. Now, these provisional codes can be revised, you can modify them, you can delete others or expand to include new codes. And provisional coding is the most flexible way of coding that can help you to explore data very quickly, because you're starting with a very open mind, and it is depends on what you you have already reviewed a lot of literature. So there are some codes that you expect they might appear. So if they don't appear, no problem, you simply delete them. Finally, therefore, we have the a priori code. And this is application of researcher-generated or predetermined list of codes onto qualitative data, specifically to assess researcher-generated arguments. So, for instance, if you are making an argument that people who go through this kind of experiences are likely to get into a depression, and they are likely to commit suicide, then those are arguments you are making. Those are intelligent arguments that you are making. And you can actually come up with codes based on those arguments. So what are those factors that will make such people get stressed to that point of committing suicide or getting into a depression? So the codes are developed either from a theory, so you can come up with these codes from a theory, or predictions about what will be found in the data. More likely what we have just said in the provisional codes, but this time you're not necessarily coming up with a list, but you're coming up with codes based on intelligent kind of arguments or guesses, or codes that are coming from the theory. So we are done with the first cycle, and we are now in the second coding cycle. Now, so we are in the second cycle. We have discussed the processes or approaches in the first cycle. So what happens in the second cycle? Now remember, from the first cycle, you have several codes that you have come up with from your data. Sometimes there are so many. Sometimes you can come up with 30. You are still coding, you are still adding them, you are still seeing new things, and you end up with a list of 30 codes, 40 codes, 20 codes. So how then do you make sense of such big number of codes and make an argument for your thesis? So you need what we are calling pattern coding. Now, pattern coding is a way of grouping those summaries into smaller number of categories, or what sometimes we call themes or constructs. So for the qualitative analyst, pattern coding has two important functions. One, it condenses large amount of data into smaller number of analytic units. And number two, it helps the researcher elaborate a cognitive map, coming up with a cognitive map, and even elaborate, understand how things happen, understand how things are interconnected. This is the time now you start connecting dots, if we put it in the layman's language. So those are two major functions of the second cycle, coding cycle. So what pattern codes look like? And the pattern codes usually consist of four. interrelated summarizers. So you can have categories or themes. You can have categories or themes. That is, you just pick the small codes that you did in the first cycle and categorize them in terms of the similarities that we talked about, and then come up with themes. So they follow under the same category. They follow under the same theme. These ones follow under another category. These ones follow under another theme. Then you can also decide to come up with patterns based on the causes. You look at different issues that are happening, different things that are happening in your research, and decide, this one seems to be causing this. This one seems to be explaining this. And number 3, it may be in terms of relationship. Remember, most of the studies that you're going to do are about people. So you may want to look at relationships among people. And number 4, you may decide to look at it from theoretical constructs. If you're dealing with a phenomena, what are the various attributes of this phenomena? If you want to, you have interviewed so many people, and you're trying to think through. If for instance you're doing a grounded theory, and you're wondering, or you're coming up with different constructs that may actually explain a certain experience, a certain phenomena, or what we call theoretical constructs. Now, how do you display this data? You can display this data using different formats, and one of them is the use of matrices. And the other one is the use of network. I will discuss the two so that we can see how they are used when you're analyzing and displaying your data. And this is also important when you're writing the report for your qualitative research report. How will you display the data that you have analyzed? You can do it using matrices. This is an example of a matrix from one of my study, and I was looking at experiences and perceptions of parents of children with cleft lip and palate, and several themes emerged and sub-themes, and this is how I presented them in my report. So, for instance, the first theme was emotional experiences of having a child with cleft lip and palate. Then the other theme was the burden of care and concern. And the other theme was relational experiences. And the other one major theme was reaction by public and friends. And the final theme was source of social support. And the emotional experiences of parents, who had or who have children with cleft lip and palate, several sub-themes emerged: shock or surprise, stress, fear, acceptance or rejection of the baby by the father, self-blame, shame, suicidal and homicidal thoughts. All these emerged under that major theme of emotional experiences. I categorize it as emotional experiences. Then the other one was burden of care and concern. And burden of care, for instance, what parents found it very difficult, those parents who got babies with cleft lip and palate, difficulties in feeding that kind of a baby. Then the other one is financial strain, because this baby requires constant attention of the doctors. Then need for full-time attention. Remember, this baby may not be able to feed himself or herself, so it may require full-time attention. And schooling was also another burden, and also speech development for this kind of a kid. Other relational experiences, I found self-isolation, strained marital relationships, divorce or separation, rejection by extended family and friends. Then the other theme was reaction by public and friends, and the sub-theme at diet were gossiping and talking ill about the baby or staring at the baby. Then the other one that was major theme in this study was the sources of social support. And some families got their social support from other family members, the church, the political leaders, and other parents with such babies, and also some hospitals. So that is how you can also categorize your data, your codes, into themes and sub-themes, or categories and subcategories using tables or matrices. So I'll go to the next one, and this is network, and I'm using another finding that I got from a different study. And in this study, as you can see, a network uses nodes. A network is a collection of nodes or points connected by link or lines that display stream of participant actions, event, or processes. So in this case, I had done a study about experiences of people who suffer stigmatization, and because they suffered from a disease we call tuberculosis. And one of the things that came out very clearly when I was investigating the nature of stigma associated with this disease is that there are four main things that were critical to the nature of stigma, and they can actually be called stigma messages. Now, stigma messages included the mark, or what is seen from outside as something differentiating these people from the others. Now, the marks are very important because they actually tell the rest of the community who to isolate and who to treat differently. They are physical marks, and they include ulcers, they include walking style, they include dressing or something like that. Then for stigmatization to occur, then people do labeling. They give labels, they give names to those people who suffer from this kind of a disease. Now, most of the time, these labels are given to these people to also differentiate them. Mostly they are derogative names. And the aim is to make them feel that they are not part of the other group. The other factor, or if some stigmatization was to occur, was responsibility. And responsibility here was about blame. These people are like that because they deserve it. These people are like that because they did something wrong. These people are like that because they bear some responsibility, either personally or their parents or a relative did something that was contrary to the societal norms, and that's why they are suffering. And the final attribute was what I call peril. And these are the danger. For stigmatization to occur, people think, or people look at the stigmatized person or the marked person as a source of danger to individuals or danger to the society. And particularly when somebody is suffering from a certain disease, usually they are seen as a danger because they can spread that illness to others and cause the same suffering. So as a result, people who suffer from certain diseases, that the diseases that are stigmatized, they are isolated because they are seen as a source of danger, peril. So this is a network diagram, as you can see, and how I've explained it, that you can use even during your presentation of information, during your writing of the report, to explain yourself, or during conferences to explain the factors associated with whatever phenomena you have investigated. Now, as I said, this diagram here shows what I actually said. When you're doing your first initial coding, you will have very, very many codes, and they could be as many as 30 to 40. You need to reduce them to allowed 20, and in the final coding, that is the pattern coding, you reduce them further to at least 5 to 7. Even for PhD, I think 5 to 7 themes are manageable. If you note that you have so many themes when you're writing your thesis, you have 20 themes, and you are almost going for your defense, please know there's something wrong with the analysis. Maybe you are not done yet with analyzing and categorizing the codes. Now, I want to talk about a very important aspect of second cycle coding, and we call it folk taxonomy. And it will help you also to reduce the number of codes. You can categorize these codes using some various aspects of relationships within what people do, what people say. So for instance, you can you can reduce the number of codes. You can categorize codes using the following approaches. One, strict inclusion. When X is a kind of Y, every time you get X, not every time, but X becomes a kind of Y. Wherever there is X, there's Y around it. Then spatial coding is about place. When you are coding and you find that most of the things that you're saying are occurring in the rural areas, then you might want to think about spatial, coding. And this is where X is a place in Y and X is a part of Y. X is a place in Y and X is a part of Y. So if you're talking about the informal settlement in Nairobi, Mathare is a place in Nairobi and Mathare is a part of Nairobi. Then cause and effect. I think this one is straightforward. X is as a result of Y. So taking drugs will cause depression. X is the cause of Y. So you can sometimes conclude that, taking drug causes depression. Then rationale, X is a reasoning for doing Y. You go to secondary school and you ask them, why do you take marijuana? Because we want to pass exam. So when you want to pass exam, we take marijuana. So X is a reason for doing Y. Then location for the action. So you ask the students, so where do you take this marijuana? X is a place for doing Y. We take marijuana behind the dormitories. Then function, X is used for Y. So why do you take marijuana? We take marijuana to stay awake. We take marijuana to remember information. So X is used for Y. Marijuana is used for motivation, self-motivation, courage, or whatever you call it. So means to an end, X is a way to do Y. So do you think taking marijuana is a way of passing exam? Yes, it's a means to an end. So they take marijuana to pass exam. That's the reasons they may give. So the sequence. So X is a step, stage in Y. X is a step, stage in Y. So here you're looking at a sequence. When does this happen? Is it a stage in the whole process of Y? All right. When does this happen? Is it a stage in the whole process of Y? Then we have attribution. X is an attribute or a characteristic of Y. So as a result of doing this, you get this, you get Y. So is an attribute or a characteristic of Y. Whenever you see somebody behaving like this, there is that's an attribute of Y. X is an attribute of Y. So for instance, if you want to attribute drugs to, or like marijuana to, mental breakdown, then you can say marijuana is an attribute of that mental breakdown. it's a characteristic, or it's an attribute. And you can also, in terms of causation, it causes that result. Then how do you use folk taxonomy? Look at this diagram keenly. For instance, if you're dealing with the way children oppress each other in schools, then you can decide to look at oppression from 2 points of view: oppression by force or oppression by feelings. So oppression by force, some of the major themes that emerged in this kind of a study include fighting. And what kind of fighting are we talking about? Fighting included scratching, pushing, punching, wrestling, beating up. And then the other force that is identified here is taking things away or messing up someone. But you can also oppress others, primarily girls, by using the feelings, like putting them down, excluding or threatening or coercing. How do they put others down? By name calling, laughing at them, teasing, trash talking, and there are different categories of each one of these sub-theme, as you can see from the diagram. So this can be an effective way when you're doing your presentation, when you're presenting your information, when you're reporting your findings. You can use this kind of taxonomy to do a presentation or to report information. So now you have everything, you have analyzed the data, and you're writing your report. How do you utilize the information that you have gotten from the analysis? Now, one of the characteristics of qualitative research, which validates the information as one of the way of ensuring validity of your data, is giving detailed description of what people said, what the participants said. For instance, an example or an excerpt here from one of the studies. This is just an excerpt from the report. In some cases, upon realizing that they had a baby with cleft lip and palate condition, some parents contemplated either to commit suicide or kill the baby. Some parents had a clear homicidal ideation on how they could actually kill the baby, as demonstrated below. So the point is, when you are writing your report, you have to give the exact information as it came from the participants. And at the bottom there, you need to indicate which participants said this. So the excerpt says, when I saw the baby, I was frustrated. I wanted to throw myself from a certain high cliff while carrying her on my back so that she could die and both of us die. But I went back home and encouraged myself. My husband was not aware. That was the respondent 19. My husband was very shocked too. After seeing the baby for the first time, he said he had not seen anything like that before. He even once suggested that if it was possible to have the baby strangled. That is respondent 16. So we give excerpts of what the respondents said as they said that, whatever they said. Now that becomes the evidence, because remember, in qualitative research, we are not using statistics. We are using the evidence from people as they said whatever they said. And that marks the end of my presentation today.